The metal chair scraped against concrete as Sarah Chen opened her swollen eyes for what she thought might be the last time. Blood trickled from her split lip, mixing with the tears she refused to shed in front of her captors. 3 weeks ago, she had been Lieutenant Sarah Chun of the 82nd Airborne, leading reconnaissance missions deep into hostile territory. Now she was prisoner number 4471 in a facility that didn't exist on any official map. Her captors had made one critical mistake, though. They assumed that breaking her body would break her spirit. They assumed that a woman soldier would crumble under pressure. They assumed that fear would make her forget everything her father had taught her about survival, everything her military training had drilled in her mind, and everything her own fierce determination had built within her soul. But as Sarah sat in that cold cell, listening to the distant screams of other prisoners, she wasn't thinking about surrender. She wasn't praying for rescue. Instead, she was planning something her enemies would never see coming. She was planning their destruction, one careful step at a time. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chun had been preparing for this moment her entire life. What they couldn't have imagined was that their prisoner wasn't just a soldier. She was a weapon they had foolishly decided to sharpen themselves. And what they would soon discover was that some people don't just survive hell. They learn to make it their home and then burn it down from the inside. This is the story of how a captured soldier became an unstoppable force of vengeance, how the hunted became the hunter, and how one woman's refusal to stay broken changed the course of a war that the world was never supposed to know about. Sarah Chun had always been different from other military officers. While her colleagues relied on standard protocol and heavy artillery, she preferred shadows and silence. Her specialty was moving through enemy territory like a ghost, gathering intelligence that could save hundreds of lives. On that fateful morning in October, she was deep in the mountains of a country whose name appeared on no news broadcasts, leading a reconnaissance mission that would either end the conflict or escalate it beyond imagination. The morning mist clung to the rocky terrain as Sarah and her 3-person team approached the coordinates they had been given. Intelligence suggested that a new weapons facility was hidden somewhere in these mountains, one that could change the balance of power in the region. What they found instead was a trap so perfectly laid that Sarah would later realize it had been months in the making. The first sign of trouble came when Rodriguez, her communications specialist, lost contact with base camp. Sarah ordered radio silence and hand signals only, but something felt wrong. The mountain paths were too quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife completely absent. Her instincts, honed by 12 years of military service, were screaming warnings that she couldn't yet understand. Marcus Webb, her second in command, noticed it too. He had served with Sarah for 3 years and had learned to trust her instincts completely. When she held up a closed fist, signaling the team to stop, he immediately began scanning the ridgelines for signs of movement. What he saw made his blood run cold. Rifle barrels glinted in the morning sun from positions that surrounded them completely. The attack came from all directions simultaneously. Sarah's training kicked in immediately as she dove behind a boulder, returning fire while calculating their escape routes. But there were none. The enemy had positioned themselves with military precision, creating a killing field from which no one could escape. Rodriguez went down first, a sniper's bullet finding its mark from impossible distance. Webb lasted 30 seconds longer before shrapnel from a grenade tore through his body armor. Sarah fought like a cornered animal, her rifle becoming an extension of her will to survive. She moved from cover to cover, each shot carefully placed to maximize damage while conserving ammunition. For 43 minutes, she held off an enemy force that outnumbered her 20-1. But eventually, even her remarkable skills and determination weren't enough. A tranquilizer dart found its mark in her neck just as she was reaching for her last magazine. As consciousness faded, Sarah heard voices speaking in accented English. They weren't celebrating their victory like soldiers would. They were discussing her capture like scientists who had just acquired a particularly interesting specimen. The last thing she remembered before darkness took her was the sound of helicopter blades and the feeling of being lifted off the ground. When Sarah woke up, she was in a cell that looked like it belonged in a medieval dungeon rather than a modern military facility. The walls were made of rough stone, and a single flickering light bulb provided barely enough illumination to see her surroundings. Her uniform had been replaced with a gray jumpsuit that smelled of disinfectant and fear. Her weapons, equipment, and even her wedding ring were gone. The door to her cell was solid steel with a small window at eye level. Through it, Sarah could see a long corridor lined with similar doors. The silence was absolute except for the occasional sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. She had been in captivity before during training exercises, but this felt different. This felt real in a way that chilled her to the bone. Hours passed before anyone came. When the door finally opened, 3 men entered. The first was clearly in charge, wearing an expensive suit that looked completely out of place in the underground facility. He was tall and thin with silver hair and eyes that seemed to analyze everything they looked at. The second man was obviously military, his posture and bearing marking him as a career soldier. The third was younger, carrying a tablet, and wearing the nervous expression of someone who was still learning his role. The man in the suit introduced himself as Dr. Volkov, though Sarah suspected that wasn't his real name. He spoke perfect English with only the slightest accent, and his manner was disturbingly polite for someone who was clearly her captor. He explained that she was now part of a research program designed to test the limits of human endurance and military training. Her team hadn't stumbled upon a weapons facility. They had been deliberately led into a trap because someone wanted to study American Special Operations soldiers. Sarah's first instinct was to attack, to use the hand-to-hand combat training that had made her a legend in her unit. But something in Dr. Volkov's eyes stopped her. He was expecting violence, almost hoping for it. She realized that any aggressive action would simply provide him with more data about her capabilities. Instead, she sat perfectly still and stared at him without speaking. The silence seemed to unsettle him more than threats would have. Over the following days, Sarah began to understand the true nature of her prison. The facility was built into a network of natural caves deep beneath the mountains. There were dozens of cells, each containing prisoners from different military units around the world. She could hear them sometimes, especially at night when the facility was quiet. Soldiers from Britain, France, Germany, and countries she couldn't identify based on the languages she heard through the walls. The experiments began on her 3rd day in captivity. They started small, almost mundane. Tests of her reflexes, her ability to solve puzzles under pressure, her physical endurance. Dr. Volkov seemed particularly interested in how quickly she could adapt to new situations and how well she maintained focus under stress. Sarah participated without resistance, but she was memorizing everything she could about the facility and her captors. She noticed that the guards changed shifts every 8 hours, and that there were exactly 17 minutes between the end of one patrol and the beginning of the next. She memorized the layout of the corridor she had seen and counted the number of steps between her cell and the interrogation room. Most importantly, she began to identify weaknesses in the security protocols that someone with her training might be able to exploit. The real torture began in the 2nd week. Not physical pain, though there was some of that, but psychological warfare designed to break down her sense of self and reality. They showed her footage of her team's deaths, edited to make it appear that she had led them into the trap deliberately. They played recordings of voices that sounded like her family members, crying and begging her to cooperate. They subjected her to sleep deprivation, sensory overload, and complete isolation and rotation. But Sarah had been trained for this kind of psychological assault. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had told her stories about prisoner of war camps that prepared her mentally for what she might face. Her military training had included resistance techniques that helped her maintain her sanity when everything around her was designed to drive her insane. Most importantly, her own inner strength, forged by a lifetime of overcoming obstacles, refused to bend no matter how much pressure was applied. By the 3rd week, Dr. Volkov was growing frustrated. His other subjects had broken much more quickly, but Sarah remained defiant. She answered his questions with silence or sarcasm. She followed his instructions only when it suited her purposes. Most infuriating to him, she seemed to be studying him as intently as he was studying her. Every day, she seemed to grow stronger and more dangerous rather than weaker and more compliant. What Dr. Volkov didn't realize was that Sarah was using every moment of her captivity to prepare for escape. She was learning the facility's routines, identifying potential weapons among the everyday objects in her cell, and developing a mental map of every corridor and room she had seen. She was also building relationships with other prisoners, using the tap code to communicate through the walls and slowly assembling a picture of who was being held where. The turning point came when they brought in a new prisoner, a young German soldier who had been captured during a training exercise that had gone wrong. Sarah watched through her cell window as the guards dragged him past, and she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of her younger brother. In that moment, her mission changed from simple survival to something much more dangerous. She wasn't just going to escape. She was going to burn this entire operation to the ground and make sure that everyone responsible paid for what they had done. Sarah began to sleep differently, eat differently, even breathe differently. She was no longer a prisoner trying to endure captivity. She was a predator preparing to hunt. Every smile from Dr. Volkov, every casual cruelty from the guards, every night spent listening to the suffering of other prisoners was fuel for the fire that was building inside her. They had captured a soldier, but they were about to face something much more dangerous. They were about to face a woman who had decided that survival wasn't enough anymore. Now she wanted revenge. The transformation began subtly, so gradually that even Dr. Volkov's trained, I didn't notice it at first. Sarah started asking questions during the daily interrogations, not the defiant challenges she had thrown at him before, but seemingly innocent inquiries about the research program. She complimented him on the sophistication of the facility and expressed what appeared to be genuine curiosity about his methods. To the arrogant scientist, it looked like the first signs of Stockholm Syndrome beginning to take hold. Sarah had spent weeks studying every guard, every routine, every weakness in their security protocols. She knew that Guard Team Alpha was more relaxed during night shifts, that the surveillance cameras in Corridor C had a blind spot near the supply closet, and that the electronic locks on the cells had a manual override system that required 2 keys. Most importantly, she had identified the one person in the entire facility who might be willing to help her. Dr. Elena Petrov was young, probably in her late 20s, and clearly uncomfortable with the more brutal aspects of the research program. She was a psychologist who had been brought in to analyze prisoner behavior, but Sarah could see the doubt in her eyes every time she witnessed the torture sessions. During their conversations, Sarah carefully planted seeds of doubt about the morality and legality of what they were doing, always framing her comments as intellectual curiosity rather than manipulation. The breakthrough came when Sarah learned about the communication system that connected the facility to the outside world. During a carefully staged conversation with Dr. Petrov, she discovered that the facility used encrypted satellite communications to send daily reports to their sponsors. The communication equipment was located in a restricted section of the facility, heavily guarded and accessible only to senior personnel. But Sarah had learned that information systems were like any other target, and every target had weaknesses that could be exploited. Sarah's first real move came during what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown. She screamed, threw herself against the walls of her cell, and begged the guards to let her speak to Dr. Volkov immediately. When he arrived, she tearfully confessed that she couldn't take the isolation anymore and was ready to cooperate fully with his research. She offered to help him understand American military training methods in exchange for better treatment and the chance to communicate with other prisoners. Dr. Volkov was suspicious but intrigued. He had been trying to break Sarah for weeks without success, and her sudden surrender felt too convenient to be genuine. But his scientific curiosity overcame his caution, especially when Sarah began providing him with detailed information about American special operations that couldn't be found in any textbook. She described training methods, psychological preparation techniques, and operational procedures that seemed to validate everything he had theorized about elite soldiers. What Dr. Volkov didn't realize was that Sarah was feeding him a carefully crafted mixture of truth and fiction designed to make him believe she was cooperating while actually gaining access to information and areas of the facility that had been denied to her before. Every piece of genuine intelligence she provided was either outdated or information that would be useless to their enemies. Every lie was crafted to send their research in directions that would ultimately prove fruitless. As part of her supposed cooperation, Sarah was moved to a different cell in a section of the facility that housed what Dr. Volkov called collaborative subjects. These were prisoners who had agreed to participate in the research program in exchange for better treatment. The new cell was larger, with better lighting and a small table where she could write. More importantly, it was located near the facility's administrative section, giving her access to areas she had only heard about before. Sarah's new status also allowed her to participate in group sessions with other prisoners, ostensibly to demonstrate American military techniques for Dr. Volkov's research. These sessions gave her the opportunity to communicate directly with other captives and begin organizing them into something approaching a coordinated resistance movement. She used a combination of American Sign Language, which none of the guards understood, and code phrases embedded in seemingly innocent conversation to pass information and instructions. Among the other prisoners, Sarah found allies whose skills complemented her own. There was Hans Mueller, a German explosives expert who had been captured during a NATO training exercise. Maria Santos, a Spanish communications specialist who understood the facility's electronic systems better than anyone except the technicians who maintained them. And Viktor Petrov, a Russian soldier whose last name suggested he might be related to Dr. Elena Petrov, a connection that could prove useful if handled carefully. The group began planning their escape with a methodical precision that only military professionals could achieve. They mapped the facility's layout using information gathered during their individual movements through the corridors. They identified weapons caches, communication equipment, and potential exit routes. Most importantly, they began to understand the true scope of the operation they were facing and the international implications of what was being done to them. Through carefully orchestrated conversations during the group sessions, Sarah learned that the facility was part of a larger network of black sites operated by an international consortium of defense contractors and rogue intelligence operatives. The research being conducted wasn't just about understanding military training methods. It was about developing techniques for breaking elite soldiers that could be sold to the highest bidder. The prisoners weren't just test subjects. They were prototypes for a new kind of warfare that would make traditional concepts of military honor and prisoner rights obsolete. This revelation transformed Sarah's mission from personal escape to something much larger. She realized that even if she and her fellow prisoners managed to escape, the facility would continue operating and other soldiers would take their places. The only way to truly end their captivity was to destroy the entire operation so completely that it could never be rebuilt. This meant not just escaping, but gathering enough evidence to expose the conspiracy and ensure that everyone involved faced justice. Sarah began using her access to the administrative section to gather intelligence about the operation structure and funding. During her sessions with Dr. Volkov, she asked increasingly sophisticated questions about the research program, claiming that her military background gave her insights that could improve their methods. She volunteered to help analyze the psychological profiles of other prisoners, giving her access to files that contained detailed information about the facility's operations and personnel. The most crucial breakthrough came when Dr. Elena Petrov began having private conversations with Sarah about the ethical implications of their work. The young psychologist was clearly struggling with the moral weight of what she was participating in, and Sarah carefully nurtured those doubts without seeming to manipulate them. She shared stories about her own military service, emphasizing the honor and duty that drove soldiers to serve their countries, and contrasting that with the mercenary motivations that seemed to drive the facility's operators. These conversations eventually led Dr. Petrov to make a decision that would change everything. During one late-night session, she confessed to Sarah that she had been documenting the psychological damage being inflicted on the prisoners, not for research purposes, but as evidence of the crimes being committed. She had access to the facility's computer network and had been secretly copying files that contained detailed records of the torture and experimentation being conducted on military personnel from around the world. Sarah realized that Dr. Petrov could be the key to not just escaping, but to bringing down the entire operation. But she also understood that the young woman was terrified of what would happen if her activities were discovered. Sarah had to convince her that escape was possible and that together they could ensure the evidence reached the proper authorities. This required a level of trust and coordination that would test every skill Sarah had developed as a special operations soldier. The plan that emerged from their collaboration was audacious in its scope and complexity. Rather than simply escaping, they would turn the facility's own systems against its operators. Dr. Petrov would use her access to the computer network to download all the evidence she had gathered and transmit it to media outlets and government agencies around the world. Sarah and her fellow prisoners would create a diversion that would allow them to reach the communication equipment and ensure the transmissions were successful. But the plan required perfect timing and coordination. Any mistake would result not just in their own deaths, but in the destruction of evidence that could expose a conspiracy involving defense contractors, rogue intelligence operatives, and government officials in multiple countries. Sarah knew that they would have only one chance to get it right, and failure would mean that hundreds of other soldiers would suffer the same fate they had endured. As Sarah lay in her cell the night before they would put their plan into action, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. 3 weeks ago, she had been a prisoner focused solely on survival. Now she was the leader of an international resistance movement, preparing to strike a blow against an enemy that most of the world didn't even know existed. The woman who had been captured behind enemy lines was about to begin her revenge, and it would be more devastating than anything her captors could have imagined. The morning of the operation dawned gray and overcast, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains that concealed the facility. Sarah took this as a good omen, knowing that the coming weather would disrupt satellite communications and create the kind of chaos that special operations soldiers learn to exploit. She had spent the night going over every detail of their plan, checking and rechecking contingencies for things that could go wrong. At precisely 0800 hours, the day began like any other in the facility. Guards conducted their morning head count, breakfast was distributed through the cell door slots, and the daily routine of interrogations and experiments commenced. But beneath the surface of normalcy, Sarah's network of allies was preparing to transform the underground prison into a battlefield where they held every advantage. The first phase of the operation began during what appeared to be a routine group therapy session led by Dr. Elena Petrov. Sarah and 7 other prisoners were gathered in Conference Room B, supposedly to discuss coping mechanisms for dealing with captivity. The room was chosen specifically because it was located directly above the facility's main server room and contained ventilation shafts that connected to the communication center. More importantly, it was monitored by only 2 cameras, both of which could be disabled without triggering immediate alarms. Dr. Petrov began the session by discussing the psychological effects of prolonged isolation, using technical language that the monitoring guards would find boring and irrelevant. What she was actually doing was providing Sarah's team with final updates on guard rotations, security protocols, and the locations of key personnel throughout the facility. The seemingly academic discussion contained coded information that would determine the success or failure of everything they had planned. At 1,147 hours, exactly 13 minutes before the guard shift change, Sarah gave the signal that would begin the most dangerous phase of her life. She stood up during the therapy session and announced that she couldn't continue participating in what she now understood was an illegal research program. To the guards monitoring through the cameras, it looked like another prisoner was having a psychological breakdown, exactly the kind of behavior they had been trained to expect and contain. What happened next unfolded with the precision of a military operation executed by professionals who had spent years training for impossible situations. Hans Müller, the German explosives expert, used a device he had constructed from cleaning chemicals and electrical components scavenged from his cell to disable the room's surveillance cameras. The explosion was small and contained, designed to look like an electrical malfunction rather than sabotage. In the 12 seconds it took for the guards to respond to the camera failure, Sarah's team moved into positions they had rehearsed mentally dozens of times. Maria Santos, the Spanish communications specialist, used tools hidden in her clothing to access the ventilation system and begin making her way toward the server room. Viktor Petrov and 2 other prisoners barricaded the conference room door, buying time for the technical aspects of their mission to proceed. Sarah herself moved to the room's computer terminal, where Dr. Elena Petrov was already logged into the facility's network with her administrator credentials. Together, they began uploading the evidence that Dr. Petrov had been secretly gathering for weeks. Hundreds of files containing documentation of illegal experiments, torture sessions, prisoner profiles, and financial record were compressed and prepared for transmission to news organizations and government agencies around the world. The beauty of their plan was that it used the facility's own systems against its operators. Rather than trying to fight their way out through dozens of armed guards, they were turning the underground complex into a broadcasting station that would expose the conspiracy to the entire world. Every second they could hold their position was another gigabyte of evidence being transmitted to safety. But the guards were beginning to respond more aggressively than expected. Within 5 minutes of the cameras going offline, Sarah could hear shouting in the corridors and the sound of boots moving at double time toward their position. The facility's security protocols were more sophisticated than they had anticipated, and their window of opportunity was closing faster than planned. The first real crisis came when Maria Santos encountered unexpected resistance in the server room. The facility's IT specialist had been working late and was still at his station when she arrived through the ventilation shaft. Rather than panicking, Maria used her training in close-quarters combat to subdue him silently and continue with her mission. But the delay meant that establishing their connection to the satellite communication system was taking longer than anticipated. Meanwhile, Sarah and Dr. Petrov were discovering that the evidence files were larger than expected, and the transmission was proceeding more slowly than their timeline allowed. They had planned for a 15-minute window before security would breach the conference room, but the upload progress indicated they needed at least 20 minutes to complete their mission. Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She ordered the other prisoners to hold their position while she went to create a diversion that would buy them the time they needed. Sarah's breakout from conference room B was like watching a masterclass in military tactics. Using improvised weapons and techniques learned during years of special operations training, she systematically disabled the guards who were converging on their position. But, rather than trying to escape, she deliberately drew attention to herself while moving away from the conference room, leading the facility's security forces on a chase through corridors and chambers they didn't expect a prisoner to know existed. The chase that followed became the stuff of legend among the survivors who later testified about what happened in the facility that day. Sarah moved through the underground complex like a phantom, appearing and disappearing in ways that seemed impossible to guards who thought they knew every inch of their domain. She used maintenance shafts, storage rooms, and even the facility's kitchen as battlegrounds where her superior training and intimate knowledge of the layout gave her decisive advantages. What made Sarah's performance even more remarkable was that she wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was conducting a sophisticated psychological warfare campaign designed to create maximum chaos and confusion. She set off fire alarms in sections where there was no fire, triggered lockdown procedures in areas where no security breach was occurring, and even managed to turn the facility's own announcement system against its operators by broadcasting false emergency instructions that sent guards running in wrong directions. But the most brilliant aspect of Sarah's strategy was how she turned her captors' own security measures into weapons against them. The facility was designed to contain prisoners and prevent escape, which meant that many of the security protocols could trap the guards as easily as they trapped the captives. Sarah used her knowledge of these systems to lock down entire sections of the complex, creating bottlenecks that prevented reinforcements from reaching the areas where her allies were still working. After 18 minutes of what Dr. Volkov would later describe as urban warfare conducted by a single individual against an entire security force, Sarah had created enough chaos to allow her team to complete their mission. The evidence had been successfully transmitted to 17 different news organizations and government agencies across 6 countries. The financial records, experiment documentation, and prisoner testimonies were already being downloaded by journalists and investigators who would spend the next several months unraveling a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of several governments. But Sarah's victory came at a terrible cost. During her running battle with the facility's security forces, she had been wounded multiple times and was rapidly losing blood from a gunshot wound to her abdomen. She had used the last of her strength to reach the communication center where Maria Santos was still working to ensure their transmissions were successful. As she collapsed against the wall of servers that had carried their message to the outside world, Sarah realized that she might not live to see the consequences of what they had accomplished. The final phase of the operation unfolded even as Sarah was losing consciousness from blood loss. Dr. Elena Petrov had used her administrative access to trigger a complete facility lockdown that would prevent anyone from leaving until outside authorities could arrive and investigate. The other prisoners, following contingency plans that Sarah had developed for exactly this scenario, had secured key areas of the complex and were preparing to hold them against any counterattack. Viktor Petrov, whose relationship to Dr. Elena Petrov had proven to be more than coincidental, revealed that he was actually an undercover Russian intelligence operative who had been investigating the facility for months. His capture had been deliberate, part of a larger operation to gather evidence of the international conspiracy. Sarah's rebellion had provided him with the opportunity to reveal his true identity and call in backup that was already positioned in the mountains surrounding the facility. As Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, she could hear the sound of helicopters approaching through the storm that had been building all day. The weather that had begun as an omen had become a shield that concealed the arrival of international forces who were already acting on the evidence that had been transmitted from the facility. Military units from multiple countries were converging on the mountain complex, guided by GPS coordinates that Maria Santos had included in their final transmission. The woman who had been captured behind enemy lines had done more than escape or survive. She had orchestrated the complete destruction of a criminal organization that had operated in the shadows for years, torturing soldiers and selling military secrets to the highest bidders. The evidence that was already spreading across the internet would expose government officials, defense contractors, and rogue intelligence operatives in a scandal that would reshape international law regarding the treatment of military prisoners. But even as Sarah felt her strength ebbing away, she knew that her mission was far from complete. The facility they had attacked was just one node in a larger network of black sites and illegal operations. The conspiracy they had exposed reached into governments and corporations around the world, and the people responsible would fight back with every resource at their disposal. Sarah's revenge had begun with her escape, but it would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by the evidence she had helped gather and the allies she had inspired to fight for justice. As consciousness finally faded completely, Sarah's last thought was of the young German soldier whose terror had reminded her of her brother. She had promised herself that no one else would suffer what they had endured, and she had kept that promise in the most spectacular way possible. The captured soldier had become an unstoppable force for justice, and Her enemies were about to discover that some people couldn't be broken no matter how hard you tried. Sarah Chun woke up in a military hospital in Germany 3 days after the raid on the facility, her body wrapped in bandages and connected to machines that monitored her vital signs. The first face she saw belonged to Colonel James Mitchell, her commanding officer from the 82nd Airborne, whose expression mixed relief with something that looked like awe. Behind him stood a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as Agent Rebecca Torres from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and a man wearing the uniform of a NATO investigator. The world had changed dramatically during the 3 days Sarah had been unconscious. The evidence transmitted from the facility had triggered the largest international military investigation since the Nuremberg trials. Government officials in 7 countries had been arrested or forced to resign. 3 major defense contractors had seen their stock prices collapse as their involvement in the illegal research program became public knowledge. Most importantly, 47 other facilities similar to the one Sarah had attacked had been raided simultaneously by international forces, freeing more than 300 prisoners who had been subjected to the same torture and experimentation. But the scope of the conspiracy that Sarah had helped expose was even larger than anyone had initially realized. Agent Torres explained that the facility in the mountains had been just one part of an operation called Project Blackwater, a collaboration between rogue elements of several intelligence agencies and private military contractors who had been developing new interrogation techniques and psychological warfare methods. The goal had been to create a catalog of torture methods that could break even the most highly trained soldiers, information that would then be sold to authoritarian governments and terrorist organizations around the world. Sarah's actions had done more than just expose the conspiracy. They had completely destroyed it. The evidence she and her team had transmitted included financial records that allowed investigators to trace money flows back to the original sponsors of the project. Communications intercepts revealed the identities of government officials who had provided political protection for the operation. Most damaging of all, the prisoner testimonies and medical records documented crimes against humanity that would keep prosecutors busy for years. As Sarah recovered from her physical wounds, she began to understand the true magnitude of what she had accomplished. The other prisoners from her facility had become heroes in their home countries, decorated for their courage and resilience in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Dr. Elena Petrov had been granted asylum in the United States and was working with prosecutors to prepare cases against the people responsible for the research program. Viktor Petrov, the Russian operative, had become the key witness in an international tribunal that was being established to try the conspirators. But Sarah also learned that her victory had come with a price that extended far beyond her physical injuries. The people behind Project Blackwater had not simply accepted defeat and disappeared. They were fighting back through legal channels, media manipulation, and more violent means. Several witnesses had been murdered before they could testify, including 2 journalists who had been investigating the financial connections between the defense contractors and government officials. Dr. Volkov himself had disappeared from custody during a prisoner transport, almost certainly with help from accomplices who remained at large. The revelation that the conspiracy was still active and dangerous transformed Sarah's recovery from a medical process into a preparation for the next phase of her mission. She began working with intelligence agencies and law enforcement organizations to identify and neutralize the remaining elements of the criminal network. Her unique perspective as both a victim and a special operations soldier made her invaluable in understanding how the conspirators thought and operated. Sarah's first major contribution to the ongoing investigation came when she realized that the Project Blackwater organization had been using a specific psychological profile to select their victims. They weren't capturing soldiers at random. They were deliberately targeting individuals whose training, background, and personality traits made them ideal test subjects for their research. This insight allowed investigators to identify other soldiers who might be at risk and to trace patterns in previous disappearances that had been dismissed as combat casualties or training accidents. The breakthrough that would define the next phase of Sarah's life came when intelligence analysts discovered that Project Blackwater was planning to resume operations using a new network of facilities in countries with weaker oversight and more corrupt governments. Rather than simply documenting these new threats, Sarah proposed a radical solution that would use her experience and expertise to infiltrate and destroy the organization from within. The plan that emerged from months of careful preparation was audacious, even by the standards of special operations. Sarah would assume a false identity and present herself as a disillusioned American soldier who was willing to sell military secrets to the highest bidder. Using the psychological profile that the conspirators had developed for their ideal victims, she would make herself irresistible as a potential recruit while gathering intelligence about their new operations and the identities of their surviving leadership. The transformation required to make this plan work was extraordinary. Sarah underwent surgery to alter her appearance and spent months learning new languages and skills that would support her cover identity. She studied the biographies of real soldiers who had been court-martialed or dishonorably discharged, creating a fictional personal history that would satisfy even careful investigation. Most importantly, she developed a personality that could convince hardened criminals that she was one of them while maintaining her own moral center and mission objectives. The operation began in a bar in Prague, where intelligence sources had indicated that Project Blackwater recruiters were looking for disaffected Western military personnel. Sarah, now calling herself Alexandra Kane, approached a man who claimed to be a talent scout for private military contractors, but who was actually a key figure in the conspiracy's recruitment network. Using a combination of authentic military knowledge and carefully crafted lies about her motivation for leaving the American military, she convinced him that she was exactly the kind of person his employers were looking for. What followed was a months-long process of vetting and testing that took Sarah deeper into the criminal organization than any law enforcement agency had ever penetrated. She was introduced to financiers, weapons dealers, corrupt officials, and former intelligence operatives who had built their criminal empire on the suffering of captured soldiers. Every meeting was recorded using sophisticated surveillance equipment that had been surgically implanted in her body. Every document she was shown was photographed using cameras built into jewelry and clothing, and every conversation was analyzed by teams of experts who were building cases against the conspiracy's leadership. But the most challenging aspect of Sarah's undercover mission wasn't the physical danger or the technical complexity of gathering evidence. It was maintaining her psychological stability while surrounded by people who represented everything she had sworn to fight against. She had to smile and nod while listening to detailed descriptions of torture techniques. She had to express enthusiasm for plans that would result in the suffering of innocent soldiers. Most difficult of all, she had to suppress her natural instinct to attack and instead focus on the larger mission that would ultimately bring all of these criminals to justice. The key breakthrough in Sarah's investigation came when she was introduced to the man known as the Architect, the mysterious figure who had conceived and organized Project Blackwater from its earliest stages. What she discovered was that Dr. Volkov, the scientist who had overseen her own torture, was just a middle manager in an organization that reached to the highest levels of government and business in multiple countries. The real power behind the conspiracy was a network of individuals who saw military personnel as nothing more than raw material for their experiments and profit. Sarah's evidence gathering reached a critical point when she was invited to visit one of the new facilities that the organization was preparing to open. Located in a country with minimal oversight and maximum corruption, the facility was designed to be even more sophisticated than the one Sarah had destroyed. The plan she was shown included new torture techniques based on advances in neuroscience and psychology, holding areas that could accommodate thousands of prisoners, and communication systems that would allow the research to be monitored and directed from anywhere in the world. But Sarah also realized that her infiltration of the organization had reached its limits. The criminals were becoming suspicious of her questions and her reluctance to participate directly in their operations. More importantly, they were planning to begin operations at the new facility within weeks, which meant that hundreds of soldiers would soon be subjected to the same torture that Sarah and her fellow prisoners had endured. The time for gathering evidence was ending, and the time for direct action was beginning. Sarah's final act as an undercover operative was to plant sophisticated explosives throughout the new facility during what appeared to be a routine inspection tour. Using techniques she had learned from Hans Mueller during their time in captivity together, she created a system of charges that would completely destroy the complex, while making the destruction appear to be an accident caused by faulty construction and inadequate safety protocols. As Sarah prepared to extract herself from the criminal organization, she reflected on how far she had come since that day when she had been captured in the mountains. She had transformed from a victim seeking survival into an agent of justice who was systematically dismantling the network of people who had committed crimes against soldiers around the world. Her revenge was no longer personal. It had become a mission that would protect every military person who might become a target of these criminals in the future. The explosion that destroyed the new facility was visible from space and made international headlines as the apparent result of industrial negligence and corruption in a developing country. But Sarah and the intelligence agencies working with her knew the truth, that it was actually the death blow to an organization that had operated in the shadows for years, preying on the men and women who served their countries with honor and courage. The woman who had been captured behind enemy lines had become the architect of the most successful counterintelligence operation of her generation, and her enemies were finally beginning to understand that they had awakened something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. 2 years after the destruction of the second facility, Sarah Chin stood in the witness box of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, facing the most important testimony of her life. Across the courtroom, seated behind bulletproof glass, were the remaining leaders of Project Blackwater who had finally been captured and brought to trial. Among them was Dr. Volkov, the man who had overseen her torture and believed he had broken her spirit. The irony was not lost on Sarah that the woman he had tried to destroy was now the key witness who would ensure his conviction and life imprisonment. The trial had been years in the making, requiring cooperation between multiple governments and intelligence agencies that rarely worked together. The evidence that Sarah and her team had gathered during their escape from the mountain facility had provided the foundation for the case, but building a prosecution that could survive the legal challenges mounted by some of the world's most expensive defense attorneys required meticulous preparation and ironclad documentation of every crime. Sarah's testimony began with her account of the original capture and the weeks of torture that followed. But unlike other victim statements, her words carried the weight of someone who had not just survived but had systematically documented and exposed the entire criminal enterprise. She spoke with the precision of a military officer and the authority of someone who had seen evil up close and refused to be intimidated by it. Every detail she provided was supported by evidence that had been gathered at enormous personal risk. As Sarah described the psychological warfare techniques that had been used against her and other prisoners, several defendants shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were hearing their own methods described by someone who understood them better than they understood themselves. Dr. Volkov, in particular, seemed to shrink as Sarah explained how she had used his own arrogance and scientific curiosity against him, manipulating his ego to gain access to information and areas of the facility that should have been beyond her reach. But Sarah's testimony wasn't just about the past. It was also about the ongoing threat that the conspiracy represented. Even with dozens of arrests and the destruction of multiple facilities, intelligence agencies had identified cells of the organization that remained active in various parts of the world. The trial was not just about justice for past crimes. It was about sending a message that would deter future ones and ensure that the survivors of Project Blackwater could never rebuild their criminal enterprise. The most dramatic moment in Sarah's testimony came when she was cross-examined by Dr. Volkov's attorney, a man who had built his reputation defending war criminals and human rights violators. He attempted to portray Sarah as an unreliable witness whose account had been distorted by trauma and a desire for revenge. His questioning was designed to break down her credibility and make the jury question whether her extraordinary story could possibly be true. What the defense attorney didn't understand was that he was facing someone who had been trained to resist interrogation by experts and had then spent years learning how to use those same techniques against her enemies. Sarah responded to each aggressive question with calm precision, providing additional details that only someone who had actually experienced the events could know. More importantly, she turned the cross-examination into an opportunity to present evidence that hadn't been covered in her initial testimony. The turning point came when the attorney suggested that Sarah's story was too extraordinary to be believed, that no one person could have accomplished everything she claimed to have done. Sarah's response was to ask the court to review the surveillance footage that had been recovered from the facility's security system, footage that had been carefully restored by forensic experts and showed exactly how she had moved through the complex during her escape. The video evidence was so compelling that several jury members gasped audibly as they watched a single woman systematically outmaneuver dozens of armed guards. Beyond her role as a witness, Sarah had also become the unofficial coordinator of support for other victims of Project Blackwater who were testifying at the trial. Many of these men and women had suffered even worse abuse than Sarah, and some were still struggling with physical and psychological injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Sarah used her experience and training to help them prepare for the emotional challenge of confronting their torturers in court and ensuring that their voices were heard by the international community. The evidence presented during the trial revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that Sarah had helped expose. Project Blackwater had operated in 17 countries and had subjected more than 800 military personnel to various forms of torture and experimentation. The financial records showed that the organization had generated hundreds of millions of dollars by selling interrogation techniques and classified military information to authoritarian governments and terrorist organizations around the world. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was the extent to which legitimate government agencies and defense contractors have been infiltrated by the conspiracy. Officials who were supposed to protect their nation's military personnel had instead been facilitating their torture and exploitation. Companies that held contracts to support military operations have been using those contracts to identify and target soldiers for capture and experimentation. As the trial proceeded, Sarah began working on the next phase of her mission to ensure that such atrocities could never happen again. She was collaborating with international human rights organizations to develop new protocols for monitoring military contractor operations and protecting soldiers from exploitation. She was also working with veterans organizations to provide support for survivors of illegal detention and torture, using her own experience to help others recover from similar trauma. The verdict, when it finally came, was everything that Sarah and the other survivors had hoped for. The primary defendants were convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The organizations that had funded and supported Project Blackwater were disbanded and their assets seized to provide compensation for victims. Perhaps most importantly, the trial had established legal precedents that would make it much more difficult for similar conspiracies to operate in the future. But Sarah knew that the legal victory, as satisfying as it was, represented only part of the justice that the victims deserved. The real victory was the knowledge that her actions had prevented hundreds of other soldiers from suffering the same fate. The evidence she had gathered and the network she had destroyed had been eliminated so completely that intelligence agencies could find no trace of any attempt to rebuild or resume operations. In the months following the trial, Sarah received decorations from military organizations around the world, recognizing her extraordinary courage and the strategic importance of her actions. But the honor that meant the most to her came from her fellow survivors, who had established an annual award in her name for military personnel who demonstrated exceptional courage in the face of adversity. The Sarah Chin Medal for Extraordinary Valor was presented each year to soldiers who had overcome impossible odds to protect their fellow service members. The final chapter of Sarah's story began when she was approached by the Defense Department about establishing a new training program based on her experiences. The program would prepare special operations personnel for the psychological and physical challenges of capture and detention, while also teaching them techniques for gathering intelligence and organizing resistance activities even under the most difficult circumstances. Sarah accepted the assignment with the understanding that she would also be working to identify and eliminate any remaining elements of the conspiracy that had targeted her. Her unique experience and expertise made her ideally suited to recognize the patterns and methods that criminals might use to rebuild their operations. She became, in effect, a guardian protecting the next generation of soldiers from the kind of exploitation she had experienced. The training facility that Sarah established was built on land that had been donated by the governments whose soldiers she had helped rescue. The curriculum she developed combined traditional military training with psychological preparation and intelligence gathering techniques that reflected everything she had learned during her ordeal and subsequent mission. Most importantly, the program emphasized the moral and ethical principles that had guided Sarah through her darkest moments and enabled her to maintain her humanity even when surrounded by evil. Years later, Sarah would reflect on the journey that had transformed her from a captured soldier into a symbol of resistance and justice. The woman who had been tortured and broken had become a force for good that had changed the world in ways that could be measured in the lives saved and the evil prevented. Her revenge had been complete not through violence or retribution, but through the systematic destruction of a criminal enterprise and the creation of protections that would safeguard future generations of soldiers. The mountains where Sarah had first been captured were now home to a memorial honoring all the victims of Project Blackwater and celebrating the courage of those who had fought back against their oppressors. Sarah visited the memorial each year on the anniversary of her capture, not to relive the trauma of those experiences, but to remember why the fight for justice was worth any sacrifice. Standing in the place where her ordeal had begun, she could see clearly how far she had come and how much had been accomplished. Sarah Chun had proven that no matter how dark the situation or how powerful the enemy, one person with courage and determination could make a difference that would echo through history. Her story became a legend told in military academies and training facilities around the world, inspiring new generations of soldiers to understand that even in captivity, even in the face of torture and despair, they possess the power to fight back and protect others from the same fate. The woman who had been captured behind enemy lines had become an unstoppable force for justice, and her enemies had learned too late that some people cannot be broken, only transformed into something far more dangerous than they ever imagined.